And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to talk philosophy. We're going to talk theistic apologetics with our good friend, Pat Flynn. I'm really fired up about the topic because when we're talking over email about what topic to choose, you brought up one of my favorites, which is the argument from composition.
So the argument from composition is one of my favorites too, Gary. It's something I've been working on for a while now, from the shadows, if you like. It's one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God because to me, I actually think it's sort of the master argument for the existence of God. I think once you do all the deeper metaphysics, I think more or less the arguments for God reduce to the argument from composition. I'll explain what I mean by that, and then I'll help set the stage for what the argument actually is. If you take the argument from contingency, which we've talked about before in this show, generally that argument starts with some sort of causal or explanatory principle that says, everything of the type contingent, any contingent thing that there is, which is anything that is, but didn't have to be or could be otherwise, those things are necessarily caused, right? And that causal principle will lead us to having to posit some being that is non-contingent or necessary, that exists through itself, and then we do our philosophy and conceptual analysis, and it turns out that necessary being is uniquely unique. It couldn't be multiplied. It's pure actuality and has to be God, right? That's a sketch of the contingency argument. But I think it totally makes sense metaphysically to ask, well, why are things contingent in the first place? Like, what is it about things such that they have a contingent nature, that they could exist or could not exist or could be otherwise in some respect, right? And I think the answer to that is the one provided by Thomas Aquinas, which is that they are composite beings on a metaphysical level, right? Meaning they have metaphysical parts, namely an essence part, which is their sort of what determination, right? This is determines what sort of thing that they are. And they have an existence part, which is their whether determination, whether they're actually actively present in reality, an actual being versus a merely possible being or something like that. Now, you shouldn't think of these parts as like Lego blocks stacked on one another. Metaphysical parts are deeply interwoven and deeply interpenetrating, really distinct, but not separable, right? If you separated, they wouldn't be there to begin with, right? Right. But the point I'm pressing is that you get a deeper explanation of contingency by analyzing it with respect to composition. And if that's right, then really I think what's ultimately fueling the contingency argument is the composition argument, if that makes sense, right? Now a lot of people don't, I think, go that deeply. They're kind of just satisfied with the fact that there are contingent things and an explanatory principle that gets you to a necessary thing. But I think the best explanation of why there are contingent things and support for how contingent things are contingent, right, is a theory of metaphysical composition that Aquinas gives us. So, in that sense, these arguments are deeply related, and I actually think that the argument from composition is more fundamental. But as we'll see, I think an advantage of the argument from composition is you can run this argument to the existence of God without something like the principle of sufficient reason, which is somewhat I don't want to say somewhat. It's very controversial. I think it's definitely true, but it's something that many people will attack. And I think the advantage of arguments from composition is that we can run an argument to God without a controversial explanatory principle like that. So how's that for some stage setting?
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, the existence and essence argument, I never put the two together with composition, but it kind of entails in itself, this idea of composition, right? Because ultimately, you end up with the bottom layer of reality being something that what the nature is that it is. So it's even simple in terms of metaphysical parts. It doesn't have metaphysical parts.
Well, let me back up a little bit, because I think the argument from composition, which again is a sort of family of different arguments, I mean, it traces way back. One could read the Republic as giving an argument from composition in the broad sense that wherever there's plurality or diversity, there's always a sort of unity or simplicity behind it as the backdrop of intelligibility, right? Then you move up to Plotinus and you start to see, more explicit natural theology or an argument for God, what he calls the one. Really arguing that, look, any composite entity is not intelligible in and of itself, right? It's always something that exists, not not just dependent upon the existence of its parts, but the specific arrangement of its parts as well. So
Right.
there's something about every composite entity that is essentially not self-explanatory, right? It cannot make sense of itself just considered in and of itself, right? So if reality is intelligible, and this might be assuming a sort of principle sufficient reason, but we can reformulate it later to avoid that. What a lot of philosophers would say is that reality cannot be comprised of only composite entities, right? Because then we're just going to have too much bruteness. A lot of things that demand answers that just don't have them, and that seems philosophically unacceptable, right? So to make reality totally intelligible, we have to trace back to something that could be self-explanatory, that could explain its own existence while being able to explain the existence of everything else that cannot explain its own existence. And since no composite entity can do that, it has to be the case that whatever could serve as that sort of self-explanatory entity doesn't mean self-caused. These are different notions. To be self-explanatory just means that it exists in virtue of its nature, not that it caused itself. That's certainly absurd, right? Whatever else that thing is, it can't be composite. But if it's not composite, it has to be absolutely simple. So the point you're making, Gary, which I'm just playing on, is that a lot of what is driving the classical theistic understanding of God, especially the commitment of divine simplicity, is this basic recognition that composite entities are always sort of restricted in their intelligibility. They always point beyond themselves for an explanation of not only why they exist, their parts, for example, but why the parts are arranged just so. So if we're going to get a coherent picture of reality where all the questions that actually make sense to ask can be in principle answered, even if we don't have access to those answers, it's just going to have to be the case that there has to be something in reality that is totally non-composite or absolutely simple. And of course, most philosophers have traditionally identified that being with God.
Yeah, I love the argument from composition just because the starting point is something that I think everybody can access and understand and grasp, because I think Edward Fazer uses the analogy of a chair. Mm-hmm. He's talking about Plotinus's thing, and about this chair has parts, and yet without the parts it's not a chair, and yet so the parts are more fundamental than the chair, and you could just keep going further and further, more and more parts. To me, it's a lot easier for the average person to start off with the argument before you get into the heavy philosophical and metaphysical stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just start with what seems like a basic intuition. And basic intuitions, like they do give you some justification or reason to think that something is true, unless and until you have like a defeater of that intuition. And I think we have a very strong intuition that whenever we see a composite entity, we always ask, who put that thing together, right?
Right. Yeah.
And, a lot of times we think of artifacts, but not just, it doesn't stop with just artifacts like chairs and stuff like that. But even to back it up even more, it's interesting when we think about composite entities, things with parts, right? That's what we mean by a composite entity. There is a sense in which the parts are less fundamental than the wholes because they're sort of conceptually understood in relation to the whole. Like I only understand what a heart is in relation to its function to the rest of my bodily system, right? But on the ontological level, there is a sort of priority in the order of being where the whole depends on its parts, right? You start to remove my bodily parts, Pat Flynn is gone, right? At this point. Right. Yet, I'm not identical to any one of my parts, which is really interesting as well. So constitution is not identical because I clearly lose any number of my parts or my parts are replaced over my lifetime, yet I still remain who I am, right? So there's a lot of really interesting, I think, metaphysical questions and implications that come out of composition and constitution and stuff like that. But yeah, just to get back to your own point, we have this very basic intuition that when we see something that has parts, it's assembled in some way, it's very instinctive to ask, well, who put it together? You think about a chair, right? It'd be incredible to think that a chair was just always structured in that way, that there's just no intelligible explanation, not just for the existence of the chair's parts, but their specific arrangement. And like, I don't know, like initially maybe that might be the case, but that's not our default intuition, right? So what I'm saying here is on the most basic level, we have a very strong intuition that composite things, not just artifacts, but I would say living beings as well, are the sorts of things that require something extrinsic to them to explain why they have the parts that they do and the arrangement and coordination of those parts. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the intuitive aspect of that is something that can be overlooked once people just kind of dive right into the deep end of metaphysics, right?
Yeah. I think it gives a kind of longer runway, to take off into the heady stuff. Where when you initially start off with something abstract like essence and existence, there's very little runway right there. You immediately start off with conceptual stuff.